The Apache girl was forced to marry a rancher, until a wild mountain man crashed the wedding. The drumbeat echoed across the dry valley, like a warning the earth itself was trying to give. But Nalia's wrists were already bound in front of her with a strip of white cloth, the Apache wedding cloth, the one meant for love, not coercion. And every step she took toward the ranch house felt like walking deeper into someone else's life. The gathered ranch hands stood stiff and uncomfortable, pretending they didn't hear her sharp breath or see the bruise on her cheek, while the sheriff avoided her eyes entirely, muttering something about peace with the locals, even though nothing about this felt like peace. Jackson Hale, the rancher twice her age, waited at the porch with a smug smile carved into his weathered face, his vest too clean, his boots too polished, as if he believed looking respectable could hide the threat he whispered into her ear last night. "Your tribe needs food, girl. I need a wife. That's the trade." The wind pushed strands of Nalia's black hair across her eyes as she stopped at the porch step, her stomach churning because she knew this wasn't trade, it was theft. And if her mother were alive, she would have told her to run. But running now would only bring Hale's men down on her people, and she wasn't willing to spill tribal blood for her own freedom. The elder who had escorted her looked pained but resolute, whispering, "Endure the moment if it protects the many." And she tried to believe that, tried to swallow the fear that made her palms sweat. But when Hale reached out to grab her chin and lift her face toward him, she flinched so hard the crowd murmured, uncomfortable with the truth suddenly too visible to ignore. The minister cleared his throat, opening his book, voice trembling as he started the ceremony. But Nalia barely heard him over the pounding of her own heart, until the sound of hooves erupted like a thunderstorm from the canyon road, snapping every head around. A single rider burst into view, dust exploding behind him, long hair flying wild, coat flaring out like a banner of rebellion. And Nalia felt her breath catch in her throat because she recognized him. Rowan Creed, the mountain man who lived beyond the northern ridge, a man who spoke little and fought hard, a man with no reason to be here except one. The moment he saw Jackson Hale gripping her arm, his entire body shifted into something dangerous. He yanked his horse to a stop, eyes locked on Nalia with a fury that wasn't for show, and the silence broke when he growled, "Let her go, or this wedding ends in a way you won't walk away from." Silence snapped into something sharp the moment Rowan's voice cut through the crowd. A silence so tense Nalia could feel it pressing against her ribs as everyone turned toward the mountain man, whose arrival felt less like a rescue and more like a storm deciding where to strike. Jackson Hale's fingers tightened cruelly around her arm, his jaw ticking as he forced out a laugh meant to show confidence, even though sweat already gathered at his collar. And he barked, "This is my wedding, Creed. You don't get to ride in here and make threats." But Rowan didn't flinch, didn't even blink, his horse shifting under him as if sensing its rider's barely leashed rage. Nalia's heart thudded painfully because she didn't understand why he had come, why he cared, why his eyes, usually so distant, held something like fear for her now. And the confusion tangled with hope so sharply she almost lost her breath. The sheriff pushed his way forward, hand hovering near his holster, voice wavering as he said, "Rowan, let the rancher handle his own affairs." But even he sounded like a man trying to reason with a bear already halfway through the cabin door. Rowan swung down from the saddle with slow, deliberate purpose, boots hitting the earth with a thud that made several ranch hands shift backward. And he walked toward the porch without lowering his gaze, without raising his hands, without any false polite words. Just raw intent radiating off him like heat. Nalia felt Hale's grip tremble for the slightest second, and she realized something important. Jackson might own land, cattle, and a badge in his pocket. But Rowan Creed owned fear. The kind that made cruel men reconsider their choices. Still, Hale yanked her closer, using her as a shield, sneering, "You want her? Then you're too late. She's already spoken for." And the humiliation burned through her because she hadn't spoken a single word today, hadn't been given the chance. Rowan's jaw clenched, and he took another step forward, low voice rumbling, "She didn't choose this. You forced it. Everyone can see that." And several townsfolk exchanged uneasy looks because he wasn't wrong. Nalia's bound wrists, the bruise on her cheek, the way her breath trembled, all betrayed the truth. The elder from her tribe stepped closer, voice breaking as he said, "We agreed for peace, not for her suffering." And Hale snapped back, "Then keep your people fed and out of my land." That's the deal, exposing the ugliness that Nalia had been carrying alone. Something cracked open inside her, shame, anger, desperation. And she finally whispered, "I did not agree." The word startling even her. Rowan reacted instantly, eyes flicking to her with a flash of something fierce and protective. And he said, "Louder now. There." Her voice, the only one that matters. And for the first time since dawn, Nalia felt the faintest spark that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as powerless as these men wanted her to believe. Rowan hadn't meant to look at her that long. But the moment Nalia's voice broke free, small, cracked, trembling like a bird trapped against a window, something inside him that had been dormant for years snapped awake. And it showed in the way his shoulders squared, the way he shifted slightly so she stood behind the line of his stance, even though she was still yards away. Hale noticed the shift too, and his grip on her arm tightened hard enough to make her wince, prompting Rowan to take another, slow, calculating step forward, as if he were judging distance, obstacles, and which bone he'd break first if this turned into violence. Nalia's breath hitched at the realization that Rowan wasn't here by accident. His presence held purpose, an intention she didn't yet understand. And though she had spoken barely one sentence to him in her entire life, she remembered the moment clearly. 2 winters ago, when he'd tracked a wounded deer near her tribe's boundary, she'd warned him with a quiet, "The ridge is unstable." And he had simply nodded, thanked her, and avoided a fall that might have killed him. It had been nothing, a passing encounter. Yet now he stood here as if repaying a debt she never knew she gave. The sheriff muttered something about unlawful interference. But no one moved, not with Rowan's gaze locked so fiercely on Hale's hand around her arm. Nalia felt heat crawl up her neck, not shame this time, but something startling, confusing, the realization that this man wasn't coming as a savior to claim her, but as a witness refusing to let a wrong be done in silence. Rowan reached the base of the porch, eyes level with Hale, and said, quieter now but far more dangerous, "Let her step away from you. Just one step. If she wants you, she'll take it toward you. If she doesn't, she'll take it toward me." And the crowd buzzed in shock because no one in this territory challenged a rancher on his own land, much less with a test so brutally revealing. Hale barked an ugly laugh, but his throat worked hard as he swallowed, and Nalia felt her knees weaken because the choice suddenly hung in the air like a blade. One step to freedom or one step to hell, and either direction would ignite consequences she couldn't control. The elder whispered her name, urging caution, but Rowan's eyes held her steady, silently offering a moment that belonged only to her, something she had been denied since this nightmare began. Choice. She felt the wind brush the back of her ribbon-tied wrists, felt Hale's fingers shaking now, felt the entire valley holding its breath as she slowly, painfully lifted her foot and took a single trembling step away from the rancher and toward the mountain man who had arrived like a storm. The moment Nelia stepped toward Rowan, the world shifted in a way she felt down to her bones, as if every breath she had held for days finally exhaled at once. But the danger didn't ease. If anything, it sharpened. Jackson Hale's face reddened with humiliation, his pride wounded deeper than any knife could cut. And the sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster as though he couldn't decide whether to maintain order or protect the man who lined his pockets. Rowan didn't move quickly, didn't gloat, didn't even smile. He simply lifted one hand, palm open, not touching her yet, offering her a gesture of safety she'd never been given by any man in this town. And Nelia stepped the rest of the way down the porch until she stood within reach of him, her breath unsteady but her chin lifted in a fragile act of courage. Rowan turned slightly, putting his body between her and Hale without ever breaking eye contact with the rancher, and the crowd instinctively parted around them as if acknowledging a shift in power they all felt, but none dared speak about. Hale spat in the dirt, growling, "You think she wants you? You think riding in here like a stray wolf makes you a hero?" And Rowan shook his head once, calm and steady, answering, "Not a hero. Just a man who won't watch her be used like a bargaining chip." The simplicity of the words hitting harder than any threat. Nelia felt her throat tighten. No one had ever spoken for her that way. Not with rage, not with pity, but with respect. And she whispered, barely audible, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure if the words were for his bravery or for the small, impossible hope he'd placed back in her hands. Hale lunged forward then, reaching as if to drag her back by force, but Rowan moved faster, stepping in front of her with a quiet, deadly resolve, catching Hale's wrist mid-air, not twisting, not breaking, just stopping him, an act of pure restraint that spoke louder than violence ever could. The ranch hands froze, unsure whether to defend their boss or pretend they weren't paid enough to die today. And the sheriff's voice wavered as he stammered, "Now, Rowan, let's not escalate this." But everyone could see who had escalated and who had simply refused to bend. Rowan released Hale slowly, pushing his arm away with a firm flick as he said, "She's taking her step. You don't get to take it back." And Nelia felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not romance, not yet, but trust, the fragile beginning of it, forming like dawn after too many nights. Rowan didn't touch her, didn't pull her behind him, didn't claim her. He simply asked softly, "Are you hurt?" And that small, human question, gentle, direct, meant only for her, became the first moment she believed she might survive this day. The air shifted the moment Rowan asked if she was hurt, because kindness in a place filled with teeth was more dangerous than any drawn gun. And Nelia felt every eye on her as she gave the smallest shake of her head, not wanting to look weak, not wanting Hale to see the fear he'd carved into her. Hale's jaw twitched violently, his humiliation curdling into something darker, and he barked at his ranch hands, "Get her back here, now." But not a single one moved. Not when Rowan stood planted like a wall between them, broad shoulders squared, one hand low near his belt where a knife glinted faintly in the sun. The sheriff tried again to assert control, voice cracking as he said, "Let's handle this proper, Rowan. Let's bring her inside and talk this through." But the sheriff's eyes couldn't hide the truth. He knew this was wrong, knew this was forced, knew the whole valley was seeing Hale's lies stripped bare. Nelia felt the elder step up beside her, his voice low but steady as he said, "The girl will not be dragged. If the rancher wishes peace with our people, then peace requires dignity." and the murmurs in the crowd grew louder because even the townsfolk, who once stayed silent for the sake of convenience, now seemed unwilling to pretend that binding a girl's wrists was acceptable. Hale's fury flared, and he snapped, "You'll starve without my supplies. I kept your tribe alive through winter." And Nalia stiffened, because that was the truth that haunted her. Her people were struggling. The hunt had been thin, the land dry, and this marriage had been offered by the elders as a way to avoid open conflict. Rowan's gaze flicked to her tied wrists, then to the fear she couldn't hide, and something hardened in him, a quiet decision forming behind his eyes. He reached into his coat, not for a weapon but for a small hunting knife, and without asking permission, without ceremony, he cut the white wedding cloth, binding her hands, the fabric falling to the dirt like a broken vow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff whispered, "God help us." And Hale went pale with a rage that trembled through his entire body. Rowan handed the knife to Nalia, handle first, a gesture not of defense, but of agency, and said, "No one owns you, not him, not even your tribe. You choose your path." And her throat tightened because this stranger had given her more freedom in 10 minutes than her entire world had in years. Hale roared, "You just declared war on me. Creed." But Rowan didn't look at him. He looked at Nalia, only her, and said, "If you want to walk away, I'll get you off this land alive. If you want to stay and fight, I'll stand with you." And though the wind carried dust across the yard and tension sparked like lightning in the air, Nalia felt something new rise inside her. Courage, fragile but growing, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. The world didn't give her time to answer, because the storm Hale had been holding back finally erupted all at once. He lunged for his rifle, leaning against the porch post, fury twisting his face into something nearly unrecognizable, and the sheriff shouted his name in panic. But Hale was already lifting the weapon, already sliding his finger toward the trigger, as though killing Rowan, or Nalia, would somehow stitch his pride back together. Rowan reacted instantly, shoving Nalia behind him as the rifle cracked through the valley, the sound exploding against the canyon walls, and Nalia felt the shock of it shake through her spine as splinters of the porch railing burst apart where Rowan's head had been a second earlier. Ranch hands scattered, townsfolk dove for cover, and even the elder stumbled backward, eyes wide with disbelief because Hale had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Rowan pushed Nalia toward the side of the barn, shouting, "Run!" But she didn't make it more than 3 steps before 2 ranch hands. One's younger, desperate, loyal to Hale out of fear rather than belief, grabbed her by the arms and dragged her back toward the porch, one clamping a hand over her mouth as she kicked wildly, muffled screams tearing through her throat. Rowan spun, saw her being hauled away, and something primal ripped through him. Rage, sharp and cold, the kind that came from watching someone innocent be taken twice. He charged forward, but Hale swung the butt of the rifle like a club, slamming it into Rowan's jaw and sending him crashing to one knee, blood spraying across the dirt. Nalia's heart split open at the sight, panic surging through her until she felt like she couldn't breathe, and she twisted against the ranch hands, biting one so hard he screamed and let go, giving her a single desperate moment to run to Rowan's side. Hale aimed again, snarling, "You want him, then you can watch him die for you." And Nalia stepped in front of Rowan without thinking, hands raised, voice cracking as she cried, "Stop, stop, please." And for a heartbeat, everything froze. Rowan kneeling behind her, stunned that she'd shielded him. Hale hesitating because even he didn't expect her to choose the mountain man over her own survival. But the real twist came not from her or Rowan or even Hale. It came from the canyon road, where the rising thunder of hooves began to shake the ground. A deep, rolling sound that made every face whip toward the horizon. While dust spiraled upward, dozens of riders emerging from the ridge, the Apache war party returning from a scouting run, their silhouettes sharp and unmistakable. The elder whispered a prayer under his breath, and even Hale took a step back, color draining from his face, because the riders weren't just arriving, they were arriving fast, led by Nalia's older brother, Kade, whose spear gleamed in the sunlight as he roared a single word that split the valley in two. "Sister!" Kade's shout cracked through the valley like lightning. And the sight of him at the head of the riders, their spears raised, their horses foaming, their faces carved with fury, sent a shock-wave through everyone on the ranch. But none felt it harder than Nalia, whose breath caught as she saw her brother's expression shift from battle-ready rage to something deeper, something broken. When his eyes landed on the bruise on her cheek and the torn cloth at her feet, Hale stumbled backward, suddenly aware that every lie he'd built this forced wedding on was collapsing. And Rowan, still kneeling from the rifle blow, wiped blood from his jaw with the back of his hand, rose slowly, as if pulled upward by pure instinct. Positioning himself between Nalia and any danger without thinking, a living shield even though he was outnumbered, outgunned, and barely standing. Nalia felt the ranch hands release her as soon as the riders thundered closer, fear hollowing their courage, and she rushed to Rowan's side, lifting his arm over her shoulder, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Don't fall. Not now." As if her words alone could keep him upright. Kade swung off his horse in one fluid motion and strode toward her, stopping only when he saw Rowan's weight leaning on her, his jaw tightening with the instinct of a brother who wanted blood, but also a leader who could read truth in a heartbeat. "Who hurt you?" Kade demanded, voice low, dangerous. And Nalia, who moments ago feared she had no power at all, stood straighter, lifting her chin as she answered, "Jackson Hale forced this marriage. Rowan stopped him." It was the first time she had claimed her voice fully, without shaking, without fear, and it landed on her brother with the force of a spear. Kade looked at Rowan, eyes narrowing, not in distrust, but in evaluation, and he asked, "You risked your life for her?" Rowan met his gaze without flinching and said, "She didn't choose him. I couldn't let it happen." The simplicity of the words carrying a weight that made Kade's stance soften by a fraction. The riders behind him grunted their approval, muttering about honor and courage. And Nalia felt her spine straighten because for the first time, she wasn't caught between worlds. She was standing in her own. Hale tried to speak, tried to gather authority back into his trembling voice. But his words fell apart under the combined force of tribal warriors. A mountain man covered in dust and blood, and the girl he thought he owned, standing tall in defiance. Nalia turned fully toward her brother, lifting the knife Rowan had given her, and pressed it into Kade's hand as she said, steady and clear, "No one owns me. I choose my path." And Kade nodded once, deeply, reverently, understanding that his sister had crossed into her own strength today. Rowan swayed slightly, breath ragged, and Nalia stepped closer, her hand steadying him as her brother declared for all to hear, "Then your path will be protected. By me, by our people, and by the man who stood for you when we did not," sealing a new bond in the dust and sunlight. The ranch yard became a battlefield of breath and heartbeat and silence, as Kade's declaration settled over everyone like a drawn bowstring. And for a moment, Hale actually believed he could still salvage control, because he straightened his spine, grabbed his rifle again, and shouted, "This land is mine. You step 1 foot farther and I'll bury every one of you." But the words rang hollow, cracking under the weight of everything that had already been revealed. Rowan stepped forward despite the blood drying on his jaw, despite the way his ribs ached with every breath. and Nalia moved with him, matching his pace as if their steps had synced without either of them noticing. While behind them, the Apache riders slowly fanned out in a half circle, their horses snorting, hooves tearing deep scars into the earth as they took positions that said one thing: Hale's reign of intimidation was over. The sheriff raised trembling hands in surrender, whispering, "Jackson, stop, please, this is done." But Hale had crossed the point where reason could reach him, rage and humiliation twisting him into the kind of man who would burn his own house rather than admit defeat. And he aimed the rifle not at Rowan this time, but at Nalia. Rowan didn't think. He lunged, shoving her behind him as the rifle fired, the shot kicking up a spray of dirt inches from her feet. And the riders roared in fury as Cadis surged forward, knocking the rifle from Hale's hands with a bone-cracking strike of his spear shaft. Hale stumbled, reaching for a hidden pistol at his boot. But before he could raise it, Rowan was there. Grabbing his wrist and twisting until the gun clattered to the ground, the rancher screaming as his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Rowan didn't strike to punish, only to stop. But Hale's fury was that of a man who would rather die than be proven small. And he lunged again, aiming for Nalia with bare hands, spitting, "She belongs." But the words cut off as Kata stepped between them, his voice a blade. "She belongs to no one." And with a swift, decisive motion, he slammed Hale to the dirt, pinning him under the weight of his knee, ending the fight with the brutal efficiency of a warrior protecting blood. Dust settled slowly as ranch hands dropped their weapons and backed away. No loyalty strong enough to tie them to a defeated tyrant. Nalia stood trembling, not from fear, but from the shock of surviving what should have broken her. And Rowan, breath uneven, met her eyes with a look that held apology and relief and something far deeper he wasn't ready to name. Kade rose from Hale's side, stepping back as tribal riders encircled the rancher, and he turned to Rowan with a warrior's bow, not low, but enough to show respect, as he said, "You stood when others turned away. For that, you have a place among us if you choose it." And Nalia felt something inside her expand, a truth blooming quietly. She wasn't stepping into a life chosen for her anymore. She was stepping toward one she wanted. The dust settled slowly over the ranch yard, as if the land itself were exhaling after holding tension for far too long. And Nalia stood in the quiet center of it all, the broken wedding cloth at her feet, the bruises on her skin still burning, yet her spine straighter than it had ever been. Because for the first time she wasn't being pushed, pulled, traded, or silenced. She was standing in the life she chose. Hale, bruised, furious, and pinned by two riders, still spat curses into the dirt. But his voice no longer held power, only bitterness. And even his own ranch hands avoided his gaze, ashamed of having followed a man who used fear as currency. The sheriff muttered apologies, stumbling over his own guilt, knowing every witness here had seen his cowardice exposed. And Kade didn't waste breath on him. He tightened Hale's restraints and told his men to escort the rancher to the tribal boundary, where the judgment would be discussed with the elders, not with bullets or threats, but with truth. Rowan, though still bleeding from the rifle strike, refused to sit, standing a little apart from everyone, as if unsure whether he belonged among them or was simply tolerated for the moment. And Nalia's chest tightened at the sight of him distancing himself, the instinct of a man who'd lived too long on the edges of civilization. She walked toward him, slow and steady, ignoring the ache in her ribs, and he looked startled when she reached up to brush the dried blood from his jaw with trembling fingers, whispering, "You saved me." But Rowan shook his head, voice rough as he replied, "You saved yourself. I just didn't let him take that from you." And the honesty of it made her eyes sting. Kadi approached them then, his expression softer than she'd seen in years, the stiffness between protector brother and mountain man easing into something almost respectful. And he said to Rowan, "My sister has a strong spirit, but even the strongest need someone who listens when their voice is ignored." A rare compliment wrapped in a warning. Yet Rowan accepted it with a nod, neither bowing nor challenging, simply acknowledging a man's right to guard his kin. The elder joined them, placing a hand on Nalea's shoulder as he murmured, "Your path will change the valley, child. What began with fear ends with choice." And she let the words settle over her like a blessing. When Rowan finally met her gaze again, something unspoken passed between them. Something that held more weight than gratitude. Something that hinted at two lives braided by crisis, but not defined by it. And Nalea felt the ground beneath her steady. Not because a tribe or a rescuer stood around her, but because she had reclaimed herself. As the riders began to disperse and the sun dipped low, bathing the valley in warm amber, Rowan breathed out quietly. "If you need a place to rest, my cabin is safe." Not as a claim, not as a demand, but as an invitation she could accept or refuse. And Nalea, feeling the first calm breath of her new beginning, answered with a soft nod that carried the weight of a promise. Her story wasn't ending. It was finally beginning. Dawn crept over the ridge with a softness the valley hadn't felt in years. The pale gold light spilling across the ranch yard where yesterday's chaos had left bruises in the earth, but something gentler in the air. And Nalea stood wrapped in a woven blanket as she watched the sun slowly paint everything new. The tribal riders had camped nearby through the night, not out of duty but solidarity. Their quiet presence a living reminder that her voice mattered now, that she had stepped into her own strength and the world had shifted to meet it. Rowan stood a short distance away, leaning against the fence he'd helped repair after the fight, his broad frame outlined by morning light, the stubborn way he held his sore ribs making her smile despite herself. And he glanced toward her with a look that held no expectation. Only the careful patience of a man who wasn't sure he deserved to stay, but hoped she might want him to. Kade approached first, his hair still damp with dew, his expression a mix of brotherly protectiveness and something like wonder as he studied Nalea. Not as a girl needing rescue, but as a woman who had rescued herself. And he placed a small carved feather in her palm, murmuring, "For the path you chose when none were safe." Before turning to Rowan with a nod that meant more than words, the elder joined them, offering both a blessing and a warning, reminding them that peace was fragile and choices carried weight. But when his gaze fell on Rowan, he added with rare softness, "You stood where many would have turned away. A man's heart is measured in moments like that." And Rowan's eyes dropped, humbled, unsure how to receive such praise. When the riders finally mounted their horses to return home, Nalea hugged her brother tightly, whispering that she was safe, truly safe. And Kade whispered back, "Then walk your chosen road," before riding off with the others, dust rising behind them like a quiet farewell. The valley fell still, just the two of them left in the widening warmth of the morning. And Nalea walked toward Rowan slowly, feeling each step settle deeper into certainty until she stood before him, sunlight tracing the curve of her cheek as she said, "Your cabin is the first place I've ever been invited to, not ordered to." A small truth that made Rowan swallow hard, pain flickering through his eyes at the thought of her past. He offered his hand, not claiming, just steady, and she slipped hers into it, soft but sure. And together they walked away from the broken porch, from the shredded wedding cloth, from the man who once believed he owned her fate. the two of them moving into a future shaped not by force, but by choice. And as the sun climbed higher, brushing the valley with light that felt almost like forgiveness, the narrator's voice settled gently over the scene. Thank you for traveling these roads with me. If stories of mercy, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, another tale waits for you right here on Crimson West.